Hey friends, welcome to episode 509 of the My 123 Cents podcast. I am your host, Kevin Huntsberger, and it has been a week. It's been a month. The month of August, we're about halfway through, just over halfway through. But man, I'm going to tell you, uh, this is where the TMI or the personal side of things comes through here. It has kicked my ass in many, many ways. I work for those who don't know, don't remember, don't care. I work at a small community college in Southern Illinois. Uh, I am the marketing director. I am a department of one and manage the marketing for not just the college, but several different aspects of the college, athletics and all these other aspects of it. So this time of year, classes started a week ago, but obviously all summer you're ramping up to build up to that, and then classes start, and it's busy, 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 busy time. Very busy time. Also, this week, as I'm dropping this podcast on August 19th, at the end of the week, taking a day off, we're going on a float trip for the weekend. So I'll be out of the loop for that. So I'm trying to prepare to get stuff ready for when I'm gone. And then the week after that, we leave for Alaska. So I'm trying to get, you know, 8 or 9 days worth of content created and scheduled and ready to go for work. But then there's also me, the personal side, the personal brand, the My 123 Cents brand, the Kevin or the Hunsberger Chronicle brand, and trying to get all that prepared and ready and scheduled and organized. Then add to the fact that this past weekend, my wife and I moved our daughter away to school, to college. Um, that was one, it's a 4 hour trip to get to her university. So we did all that, drove up there on Saturday morning, moved her in, figured things out that she needed, wanted, was missing, went to the store, got all that, got her set up, hit the road. It's another 4 hours or close to 4 hours back. And the emotion of dropping off your last child to college, it's been an emotional week. It's been an emotional month. Um, and it just, I had ideas for the podcast. I was going to try to get stuff knocked out with Chad early. I worked late a couple nights this past week. And again, I'm not doing all this. I'm complaining or anything like that. I'm just kind of letting you know where I am in preparation for the podcast and what to kind of expect or see over the next couple of weeks, because it is going to be, through we come back, I think it's like in the week after Labor Day, I'll be back in the office. We get back home to Illinois, I think, on a Friday, the Friday after Labor Day or something along those lines. So I'm saying all this to say I'm getting stuff organized and trying to get things together, but unfortunately, sometimes this brand is the one that ends up suffering. And so this week, it's going to be a short episode. I had contemplated several things when my daughter graduated from high school just a couple of months ago, back in May. I did a comparison of 1991 to 2024. 91 is when I graduated from high school. I was going to do the same thing this month and this week with the podcast, and compare the summer of 91 to the summer of 2024. But I decided not to do that. It was very similar. And I've talked ad nauseum about the things that went down in the summer of 1991, specifically Ric Flair jumping ship and going to the WWF. To me, at the time, was a huge deal. So this week, I am going to just talk briefly about SummerSlam 1990. It is probably my favorite of the SummerSlams. I actually also thought about doing a Wrestling Under the Influence with this, but we had some friends over today as we were preparing for this float trip, and I had multiple beers that this was hours ago, so I'm not recording this under the influence. I'm actually recording this in the evening, and it's going to be dropping quick. It's going to be a quick turnaround, but it's okay. It is okay. And again, I'm not trying to burden. I've also contemplated the idea with the podcast, once a month, maybe doing something not wrestling related, and maybe trying to pick up some new listeners and new viewers to the show. I don't know how the core audience feels about it. It would be different topics, pop culture topics, and those kinds of things, just things that aren't necessarily in the wrestling space. But I also, on Friday, picked up a bottle of, if you're not watching, I'm showing it to the camera right now. It is a bottle of the WWE Prime. And we know the history of Prime with WWE. It's a hydration drink. That's what it says on the bottle. It's 25 calories. So this is called Meta Moon. It says 10% coconut water. So I'm going to also try this on the air. I like the Prime. This is the caffeine free. This is not the energy drink. I've not had the Prime energy drinks. I try to not have energy drinks, but this is, if you can see it, it's got a pinkish hue to it. It looks kind of like a pink lemonade. So we see the Prime branding all over WWE these days with Logan Paul. It smells like a tropical punch, like a fruit punch, more than anything. I'm going to go ahead and get this part of the show out of the way. It's good. It's very sweet, very refreshing. I like Prime. I prefer the blue. I don't even remember the flavor of it. I like the blue Prime. This almost actually has almost like a cotton candy vibe going on with it. And like I said, it's got the coconut water in it. That's actually the second ingredient. Total sugar, only 2 grams. So, I mean, this stuff is not, I'm not endorsing it as a health drink by any means, but it's not, obviously a glass of water would be better for you. But this is good. It's not overly syrupy or sweet or sugary. So I like it. And I like the WWE branding on it. Obviously, that's why I bought it. I picked this up at a Target. And I don't know much more about if there's a marketing effort or if WWE is doing different primes or anything like that. But I thought, what the heck? Try it, have it on the show. But that was that. And let's talk a little bit about SummerSlam. SummerSlam started back in 1988. I can still remember, hearing about the show via friends who had watched it. I was in high school for the first handful of SummerSlams. By 1990, though, it was the summer of my senior year. I did not see this when it happened. I watched it later. I actually ended up buying the VHS, and I have it around here somewhere. I can't find it. But I purchased it at a flea market when we were living in Alabama many years after the fact. But why this show resonates with me again, this is the era, and I think probably the first mini SummerSlams. This past year, 2024 SummerSlam, I feel like every match on the card had a purpose. There was a reason behind it. Rhea Ripley and Liv Morgan were fighting for the Intercontinental title. We're fighting for the Women's Championship, and then of course we learned Dominic was in the mix, and CM Punk and Drew McIntyre. There was a feud there. And all the other matches were championship matches, and they had some kind of meaning behind them. The Bloodline, Solo Sikoa, and Cody Rhodes. So everything was there for a reason. And in those early days of SummerSlam, the very first SummerSlam, we got Junkyard Dog versus Ravishing Rick Rude, for example. There was no feud going on there. It was a match that was put on this show. And conversely, we had Hercules versus Jake the Snake Roberts. Why we didn't get Snake and Rude in a match? Because they were the two that were feuding. In fact, Jake the Snake interfered in the Rick Rude Junkyard Dog match to get the dog disqualified. So in those early days, it felt like, in WrestleMania was the same way. You had just a bunch of random matches to fill a card, to put everybody on the show, to spotlight and highlight. And I feel like in 1990, we were still seeing that. And I'm not going to go through every match or anything by those means, but a fun fact, Shane Douglas actually wrestled in the dark match on this show, beating Buddy Rose, of course, of the Blowaway Diet fame. To me, the big matches, the big significant matches were the 3 championship matches, but this was when WWE was billing. This may have been the very first time they did it for a SummerSlam. In fact, I know it's the first time they did it for a SummerSlam. They billed it as a double main event. Hulk Hogan versus Earthquake. Hogan was returning. He had been attacked by Earthquake earlier in the year, had his ribs crushed. It was all that on the Brother Love show. The other main event, and what actually went on last that night, which was truly, to me, the main event, was Ravishing Rick Rude battling the Ultimate Warrior inside a steel cage for the World Wrestling Federation Heavyweight Championship. And I feel like, and I've talked about this before, with the Ultimate Warrior winning the title at WrestleMania 6, Hulk Hogan never really, in my opinion, completely stepped out of the spotlight. Warrior never had the opportunity to shine. And I think business was already starting to take a dip before Warrior won the belt. The same can be said with Sting beating Ric Flair. It was a very parallel universe with what was going on in WCW and the WWF back in 1990. Two neon wearing, face painted, muscled up guys who were at one time a tag team many, many years earlier, or a few years earlier, go on to find success at the two biggest promotions going on at the time and winning their respective championships. I think WCW probably did a better job with Sting to an extent, but I think wrestling fans, we like that familiarity. Even though a lot of times you hear we want new, we want to be surprised. I think we still resonate and go back to our comfort food of wrestling and go back to what makes us feel good and makes us feel nostalgic. And by 1990, Hulkamania had been running wild for 6 years. It was January of '84 when Hogan wins the belt, holds on to it for 4+ years, loses it, goes away briefly. Randy Savage, who I think had a little bit more success in his run. I think because Hogan was gone a little longer, it felt like Randy maybe stepped up and was used better as the heavyweight champion, even though he was still, I feel like, was in Hulk Hogan's shadow because, Survivor Series, we do the co-captains. Hogan and Savage are co-captains now instead of having one of them captain the team, which why wouldn't the champion captain the team? That didn't happen. So now let's fast forward to SummerSlam 1990. Warrior wins the belt. I am happy that they used him in the main event. And it wasn't just Hogan versus Earthquake as the main event with no title and really no stakes in that Hogan Earthquake match. Warrior handily beats Rude. And I'm going to get to a scenario in just a few minutes too, as we wrap up the SummerSlam conversation. But I want to talk about a few more things that happened that night. The other, to me, significant matches. One was Randy Savage versus the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes. And this is coming towards the end of Dusty's run. In the WWF, we see that Sapphire, who was supposed to wrestle Sensational Sherry, doesn't show up. There's some thoughts that maybe the $1 Million Man has become involved with Sapphire and is paying her off to not be there. It distracts Dusty later in the night, which cost him his match with Randy Savage. So I think that, Macho King was still running wild here and was still a significant player in WWE, WWF at the time. Him and Queen Sherry, a great combination. I think that they knocked it out of the park with what they were doing. We saw the Hart Foundation end up beating Smash and Crush of Demolition in a best 2 out of 3 falls match to win the tag team titles. This is their first run since losing them in the fall of '87. So about a 3-year run without the belts, coming back as good guys and winning the gold. The Road Warriors, the Legion of Doom, came out and interfered. And I'm going to talk about the Road Warriors and Demolition and the Ultimate Warrior all here in just a couple minutes. Because this was a time when, well, I'm going to wait. Hold on. The last thing I want to talk about as far as SummerSlam specific to itself is the Texas Tornado, Kerry Von Erich. I've said it before. At that time was my favorite wrestler. It was great to see him in the World Wrestling Federation and then coming in and instantly winning the Intercontinental Championship. I think he'd been there about a month. He fills in for Brutus Beefcake, who had basically destroyed his face in that parasailing accident. I think Beefcake would have ended up winning the IC title. He did hand Mr. Perfect his first pinfall loss at WrestleMania 6 as well. So we were on a trajectory to see Beefcake win the IC title. Kerry Von Erich wins it, and a very unique situation sets up here too, where for the first time, and I don't have it in front of me, so I'm not gonna stick my neck too far out on it, but um, having all babyface champions, and I know uh, it happened before, but it's rare that all three champions are baby faces. And so at that time, you had Kerry Von Erich, you had now the Hart Foundation, and the Ultimate Warrior still as the champion. Kerry, of course, loses the belt back a couple months later, back to Mr. Perfect. So that balance goes back to where it was. I don't know what the rule of thumb is on having good guy versus bad guy champions for how long and how they figure out all that stuff, but they do it, and that is what it is. But it's interesting to me too, as I'm looking at these results, and I guess the one match I had forgotten about from that card is the Warlord beating Tito Santana, which, if you remember at WrestleMania 6, the Warlord, or I'm sorry, Tito Santana lost to the Barbarian. So both members of the Powers of Pain, after they split, end up wrestling Tito at separate big tent pole flagpole event pay-per-views and beating him. So fun little fact there that I just noticed as I'm sitting here watching or reviewing these SummerSlam notes. So what I wanted to get to is talking about, the Warrior and his run as champion and Demolition and the Road Warriors. For years, that was going to be the dream match, Demolition versus the Road Warriors. And I think that Axe, whatever the story, the real story is behind it all, Axe was obviously not going to be doing as much with the company, with wrestling, and almost was acting as a manager of sorts to Demolition. And Crush is brought in. Crush, I liked Kona Crush. I've talked about this before too. I don't think him being in Demolition, to me, it was less than for a replacement for Axe. So it lost some of its flair when the Road Warriors or the Legion of Doom started feuding with Demolition. They had already lost the belts, so I would have rather seen Legion of Doom, I think, in that match against Demolition for the belts. But instead, the Legion of Doom waits a year and wrestles the Nasty Boys and wins the belts. So it goes from Demolition to the Hart Foundation to the Nasty Boys to Legion of Doom, instead of us getting the Legion of Doom and Demolition match. So it is what it is. Also, that fall, the Warrior starts teaming up with the Legion of Doom in six-man tag team competition against Demolition. So the heavyweight champion is now part of a six-man tag, which to me also watered down and took away from the Warrior's presentation and his viability as champion and his, being a credible champion. Whereas Hulk Hogan was, taking on Earthquake and, doing all of that kind of stuff, wrestling still the big names and still kind of shining. And, 32, 33, 34 years later now, I can look back on it and be a little more critical of it. At the time, I probably didn't think much of it, but to me, it didn't make much sense having the Warrior in that position. Either have him as champion and a fighting champion and defending against all comers and creating that heel factory like they had done for Hulk Hogan, or here's what I would have kind of liked to have seen happen. Had the whole Iraq situation and Kuwait and the war, the Desert Storm stuff not happened, and Sergeant Slaughter comes back and turns heel and the Iraqi sympathizer. And I don't know the circumstances of why Rick Rude left shortly after SummerSlam, but how would it have been if Rick Rude would have beaten the Ultimate Warrior at SummerSlam? If they were going to go the path of putting the Warrior with the Road Warriors, get the belt off of them and do that. Go in that direction. Otherwise, find someone else to team up with the Road Warriors and go that route. Or Rude beats Warrior at SummerSlam, holds on to the belt and goes to, because eventually, inevitably, we're going to head back to Hulk Hogan winning the title at WrestleMania 7, having that big moment. Everyone goes home happy. Hogan must pose. So having it to where Hogan beats Ravishing Rick Rude for the belt at WrestleMania 7 instead of Sergeant Slaughter, which I think in that era, it wasn't going to matter. You knew Hulk Hogan was going to come back and win the championship, whether it was against Rick Rude, whether it was against Randy Savage, whether it was against the Ultimate Warrior, whether it was against Sergeant Slaughter, whomever it was going to be, you knew Hogan was going to win. So I just think a better story could have been told with Rick Rude. Um, to me, it would have been more interesting than how it went. Sergeant Slaughter, in my opinion, was past his prime, 84, 85, 86. I could have gone with a Sergeant Slaughter run, but by 91, I wasn't buying it. I think Rick Rude was at the top of his game in 90 still and looking good, was a credible threat. He had already beaten the Warrior at WrestleMania for the Intercontinental Championship a year earlier, so it was plausible. We could have seen that happen, and maybe Demolition interferes in that match to then set the Warrior up to go with the Legion of Doom to feud with Demolition later. I don't know. I'm just throwing out some interesting scenarios, or what I find to be interesting scenarios. If they were not going to truly do, but that would have been a long run with a heel champion in the WWF at that time, which was unheard of. Going from SummerSlam to WrestleMania with Rude as the champion. But you could have also done another rematch at the Royal Rumble in 91, and Rude ends up winning the championship that night instead. That's a scenario as well. And maybe at SummerSlam 1990, instead of getting Rude Warrior, we get Rude and get the Warrior against some other potential threat to the title. But again, back then, looking back at it now, it would, even then, I think it was pretty obvious that a lot of these guys were not going to hold a candle to and pose a credible threat to the championship. I think Sergeant Slaughter beating the Warrior, because I thought, okay, the Warrior is going to easily win this. But obviously he did not. And, maybe we get Warrior versus Macho King at SummerSlam 90 in the cage. I don't know. And now I'm throwing out all these extra scenarios, and I didn't think it through as much as I should have, and I'm starting to ramble. So that to me says, Kevin, it's time to say goodbye. Say we'll see you next week. I am working on some ideas and some things that I'm hoping to knock out. I appreciate your patience, and I appreciate most of all you listening and or watching to this episode and to the previous 507, 508 with the bonus episode that we did. So check it out, subscribe, leave a review. If you want to buy some thigh huggers or buy a shirt off of Pro Wrestling Tees, I appreciate that support as well. Leave a review again, and we will talk again very soon. Have a great week.